Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Tim Palmer. And coming up today, the flood levy tabled in Parliament. But will the independents support it? Who are the phantom Liberal leakers spreading stories about friction within the party? And why the Vatican won't let Catholics phone in their confession. Our panel tonight, ABC economics correspondent Stephen Long, Simon Sheikh from activist group GetUp, and the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, John Roskam. And good afternoon to all of you.
Tim.
The federal government has introduced legislation for its flood levy into Parliament, but it's immediately hit an obstacle. Julia Gillard's still battling to win over independents and the Greens so it can pass through the lower house. Tasmanian Independent MP Andrew Wilkie says he's yet to be persuaded.
I share the view of many notable economists who say let's just run the deficit out another 12 months. I mean, the point here is not whether or not we will fund the reconstruction of Queensland and Victoria and other places. That will occur. The issue here is the best mechanism for making it happen. Now, I would add there has been a lot of talk about the levy itself, but I think there needs to be just as much of a conversation about the proposed cuts to government expenditure. And I have been persuaded that some cuts, such as the cuts to the solar flagship program, the cut to the Australian Learning and Teaching Council, I think those cuts are unwarranted and in fact quite damaging.
Well, Queensland Independent Bob Katter is taking a more pragmatic view, saying he has little choice but to back the levy.
The flood levy. You're supporting the flood levy, aren't you, Bob? Bob, are you supporting the flood levy? Are you supporting
a cyclone on? Yes, of course I am.
Okay, but why?
Well, I think that was a yes. Mr Katter would still like a permanent disaster fund, but he says he won't push for it. So, Simon Sheikh, you probably know a bit more about what at least four of the independents are thinking. You wheeled them out under your aegis today in front of Parliament. And it's not just the 1.8 that the opposition and the government have been arguing about. The whole $5 billion seems to be up for grabs with these guys again, isn't it?
That's right, Andrew. We saw in that grab there raising the point. All four independents have made it very clear that they have a number of demands. The Gillard government will need at least two of them, and that means she's going to have to give something up. The good news is all four of them do now want, and they've now publicly said, that they want solar flagships, just one of those programs, probably the best of those carbon abatement programs to be saved, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that in our modern day democracy with this hung parliament scenario, we can have debate and negotiation. We know we're going to have a reconstruction effort. We know it will be funded. As Andrew says, it's all about how and what we cut and what we save along the way.
Have they got a similar commonality on what they want to have cut instead, then, of that solar program?
Well, we raised today one possibility, which is to close a tax loophole that means that the crude oil facilities of different parts of that industry are being taxed in different ways. Just that loophole, if it were closed, would bring in an extra $2.4 billion over the forward estimates period. There are parts of the Australian budget that can be looked to for savings, and we've been very forward in talking to the independents about these kinds of savings.
John Roskam, can I ask, I mean, to some extent, do you think with this argument now springing up, the actual argument about the levy component of the $5 billion is pretty much over?
I'm not sure that it is over. Look, there's many issues that Australians want answered, and it's no surprise that Bob Katter is happy to have the rest of Australia pay for the flood reconstruction efforts in Queensland.
Oh, he said it pained him to agree.
Well, we still need to know about why didn't the Queensland government take out insurance? Why won't the government find budget cuts from other areas? The solar rebate scheme should have gone together with most solar rebate schemes because it is completely ineffective and expensive. And when Julia Gillard appeals to Tony Abbott to help her raise taxes, it's like John Howard appealing to Kevin Rudd to help him pass work choices. Look, the flood levy has a long way still to go before we get this new tax.
The point you raise about the lack of insurance of the infrastructure in Queensland is being pushed around a bit now. Nick Xenophon, the latest. Stephen Long, where do you see this moral hazard issue that's being pointed to?
Well, I think that Nick Xenophon is right, and the Queensland government should have had insurance. And it's bizarre to me. I remember when I was presenting PM and this issue first came up, I was absolutely shocked that there was not insurance in place, and there is a moral hazard issue there. That said, I disagree with the idea that we should be looking to immediately wind in the deficit, and I've got no issue with the flood levy one way or the other. I mean, to me, it's not a big problem having a small levy on high to middle income earners, and there could be some economic benefits at the margins if the economy is going on the trajectory that the Reserve Bank expects. That is in effect like a de facto rates rise that could wind in consumption, and you don't want the government spending big on reconstruction and people working at the same time. So it could actually make economic sense. But I don't see why there's this obsession with having a levy as in broad terms, as opposed to worrying so much about us having a deficit for another year. This is the surplus fetishism that was set up over more than a decade. And in economic terms, there's no issue with having a wafer-thin surplus as opposed to a slight deficit. It doesn't matter one way or the other.
It's PR in politics because there is nothing but an arbitrary line between a small surplus and a minor deficit. Now, on the moral hazard point...
it allows a lot of breastfeeding, though, doesn't it?
Well, unfortunately, that's what politics unfortunately has come to in some way. I would hope we could have a more intellectual conversation with the Australian public. But on the insurance issue, this is the state government insurance issue. State governments being ready to respond to these kinds of things by having insurance. I think it's very likely that Nick Xenophon will get a deal with Julia Gillard on this. I can't see how she won't agree to that kind of initiative where state governments in future will have to have this kind of insurance. It costs about $50 million in order to qualify for future federal government support.
Might be the last time that we need to raise a levy for that sort of infrastructure, at least, if that gets through. Well, of course, one of the offshoots of the levy has been the foreign aid discussion, and it seems all is not that well at the top of the Liberal Party. According to Fairfax newspapers today, Deputy Leader Julie Bishop has been warring with Tony Abbott over the coalition's plans to slash $448 million in foreign aid to Indonesian schools. The Shadow Foreign Minister is apparently furious at implications that she approves the cuts, and that gave her government opposite, Kevin Rudd, plenty of ammunition in question time today.
Australia's foreign aid program is designed to support Australia's core national interests, our national economic interests, our national security interests and our international humanitarian interests, and that's precisely what this program in Indonesia does. Mr Speaker, the problem for the Leader of the Opposition is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is right on this, absolutely right.
Well, Coalition Senate Leader Eric Abetz says rats within the ranks are to blame for the leak.
I think we all know who the leakers are, and as happens with leakers, they carry neither the respect of their colleagues nor, if I might say, of your profession, because the people that leak are people that cannot be trusted. It is a very, very small number, and one or two might be yet.
Have you ever confronted any of these leakers?
Look, what I may or may not say within the privacy between colleagues or the party room, I'm not going to leak.
Well, John Roskam, let's have a quick look at the evolution of this one, because very early in the week there was a suggestion there was a schism within the Shadow Ministry about the potential to cut or to slate a cut for African aid, and Julie Bishop supposedly angrily defended that at that stage. She then gets slammed when the cut to Indonesia happens in the press. Greg Sheridan, amongst others, calls her a hopeless Foreign Affairs spokesman. Not surprisingly, angrily, she then supposedly storms into Tony Abbott's office demanding that he own the decision. She's been a real survivor under successive coalition leaderships as the deputy leader. Is this the worst relationship she's had?
Oh, look, I'm not sure it is. Julie Bishop's been in politics a long time, and I'm sure she'll see worse moments and better moments than this. The point is, there's lots of good things about our foreign aid budget. But at the same time, what Kevin Rudd didn't say is large parts of our foreign aid budget are about getting him a job at the Security Council. So the point about foreign aid is it's completely appropriate for the coalition to have a vigorous, strong argument about cuts and about what's appropriate. But you don't want to have these arguments in public, and Tony Abbott has a problem that there's going to be many more robust discussions that need to be had, but there's no way you can have these discussions if someone's then going to run to Fairfax and recount everything that was said at the Shadow Cabinet table. It's a problem.
Do you think they picked the right target within foreign aid this time? I mean, Tom Allard had an article from a village in Lombok, Te Batu today, where one of these projects seems to be diverting girls who'd get married typically at 11. Now one of them wants to be a doctor. Isn't that exactly what we'd like to see?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, isn't that the job of the Indonesian government to provide schools? 2, when we talk about these schools programs minimising terrorism, there's not very many terrorists who weren't middle class. So this idea that we have to provide hundreds of millions of dollars to another government to do the things that government should be doing itself anyway, I think is a misnomer. And then thirdly, we have to know about, is the money going to be well spent? Look, we have to realise the Gillard government couldn't spend $16 billion of its own money on schools properly without waste and mismanagement. So the idea that there's not $400 million of savings, I think is wrong, and we have to argue it out. But the idea that the foreign aid budget should be immune from cuts, I think is wrong.
Simon, sticking on this particular project, I mean, is John right? Should we be just pressuring the Indonesian government to take care of its own school system and improve the Islamic pesantren system so that we don't have extremism taught?
You extend that analogy out and say all governments should be left to themselves, or even the Indonesian government should be left to fund their own schools. That's a head-in-the-sand view. We all know we live in the real world here, where the global economy just doesn't mean that every country can afford to deliver safety and security. It's in our interest, it's in our region, but more so than that, it's in our humanitarian interest. The Australian public do support an aid program, and the polls have shown that over the years, that is well directed and well managed, and it's ridiculous to suggest that we can just not worry about what other countries are doing and not worry about our safety and security in the region.
It is only a virtual cut in any case, isn't it, really? This is just an alternative to the levy. But what does it say about the Coalition's broad position, do you think, on
It's
aid?
actually a very important cut, though. Not so much about the specific program. I think we'll all forget about that, and I think the Coalition will happily forget about that one as well. But importantly, for the last 4 or 5 years, there's been 100% bipartisan support on the aid program. Now, that is starting to change. The aid sector worked very hard to form alliances within the Liberal Party, within church groups. They had champions like Andrew Robb, and of late, Julie Bishop, who has actually been a fan of the aid program as a whole and of reaching those Millennium Development Goal targets. This is an important step in the wrong direction, and the aid sector do have some tough work now to make sure that this doesn't go further backwards, because it's all too easy for either major political party in Australia to go chasing votes by saying, you know what, aid starts at home, help starts at home. The realities are far more complex than that.
Stephen Long, back to the raw politics of this. I mean, this week, this dissent within the shadow ministry